All right. So, guys, if you guys didn't know, YCS Richmond finished, about a couple weeks ago, right? And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was how quickly format changes. And we can check Dual Chronicles here to kind of get an insight into a very important topic in the in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, which is it hand trap format or a board breaker format, right? Like, is it better to play hand traps, or is it better to play board breakers, or do you play both? And that's kind of like something that I always try to ask myself and think about as I go into YCSs, because your non-engine really does play a major role in how well you do at the YCS level, right? Because a lot of like your decision making when it comes to the deck building aspect of, do you play hand traps, do you play board breakers, if so which hand trap, if so which board breaker, it just plays a huge role, right? So let's start at the beginning, which is YCS Sao Paulo, right? YCS Sao Paulo was the kickoff of the 2023-2024 season, and in this tournament, you'll see that the deck that I played was an Unchained deck, and if you look in my main and side deck, I had 0 hand traps, right? I didn't play a single hand trap. And let's kind of like talk about the evolution of the formats leading up to now. Back then, we had a Rise Heart being legal, right? Hand traps were very much not that effective into Kashtira, because even if you hand trap the deck, they still are able to keep their bodies on the board. So, like, let's say you imperm a Unicorn, right? Having a Unicorn on the board is still very powerful. They have cards like Theosis or Birth. With Frenir, you get super punished. And so you almost wanted to break the board rather than try to hand trap the board, because the board they make, although it is very powerful, does have a lot of glaring weaknesses, right? Book of Eclipse, booking everything down, turning off their Macrocosmos. Cards like Thrust that are inherently live because of a Rise Heart's mandatory effect to attach are just very strong board breakers, right? And there weren't really that many combo decks at the time that punishes you for playing board breakers, right? No one really played, for instance, an example, Manadium. No one really played Infernoble that much at this event. If you look at the top cut breakdown, it was Kashtira, Unchained, like the Pearly deck, which even hand trapping Pearly is a little bit weak sometimes. You almost kind of want to like thrust into like a Herald to like answer their Noir, because if they have like cards like Pearly Street, it's very hard to imprint them, right? And so like if you look at like kind of the decks that are in the current top cut breakdown, you'll see that like hand traps weren't really that effective. They were okay, but they weren't really like consistently doing what you wanted them to do, which is make your opponent pass turn. Now, we're going to fast forward to the next YCS right after. And we have YCS Cancun, Vancouver, right? Jesse decided to do something a little bit different, which is he main deck Nibiru, okay? And I think this was a meta call in response to people maybe like dwellering him, right? And if people try to blind dweller Jesse, having cards like Nibiru is very good at answering that. But for the most part, he's still taking more of a board breaker approach rather than a hand trap approach, right? And so you see like right there in the side, cards like Ash Blossom are just generic coverage. But the mainly you have cards like Lightning Storm, Change of Heart, Evilly Match. Mariner Might is a board breaker for the mirror match. Druid Worm is a pseudo hand trap / breaker, because Druid Worm like not only does it disrupt your opponent, but it also puts a bot in the board, which is obviously like really strong. And you'll see that for the most part, people weren't really playing hand traps, or they were playing like a mix of hand traps and a mix of breakers. Like it was still 50-50, mainly because Kashtira was still legal, right? Like look, this deck had no hand traps at all. This deck had like what 9 hand traps with Tackle Crusader to like trigger Storby Torby and then Book of Mooning your opponent turn 0, which is kind of nice. You had right here Quanto with a combination of hand traps with breakers like Book of Moon and Talents, right? So I would say by YCS Vancouver, it went from board breaker format to kind of like 50-50, like combining half and half, because the format got a little bit more diverse. So you can't just rely on completely board breakers. You also need some hand traps for some of the other decks in the format. Like for example, having Ash in your deck and Imperm in your deck are very, very strong against the Branded Chimera deck as well, right? So you just wanted like those type of cards. And then if you look into Cancun, which is the YCS right after, you'll see that because a Rise Art, like all these YCS I'm talking about, have one thing in common, which is Kashtira and a Rise Art being legal. Because of a Rise Art, the format kind of like the non-engine for the format was completely warped around that one card, right? Like people had to play answers to a Rise Art because of how powerful it was. Like if that card sticks, or if the Macrocosmos effect sticks, it's just too busted. And you'll see that for the majority, of the decks, we still have that kind of like 50-50. 50% board breakers to answer Kashtira, 50% hand traps to answer the rest of the decks in the format, right? Now this is where everything changed, okay? Dorban is still the same, but this is kind of like where everything really changed. YCS Indianapolis. If I'm not mistaken, this is the first YCS in which the Age of Overload cards were finally legal, which introduced like Sinful Spoils, like the Wanted engine. You had SP making his debut. You had Typhon making its way onto the main stage, and a very oppressive card finally got banned, a Rise Heart. Now, at YCS Indianapolis, you'll see that like what happened, right? For the majority of the part, people started playing more hand traps. Ash was always a mainstay staple, but cards like Valor and made its way back into the format. And Santoli, the person who won the YCS, made an insane meta call to main deck enemy controller for the mirror match, right? And he got heavily rewarded for that, obviously by winning the YCS, and also he had 3 Impulse, but he made the meta call to main deck 3 enemy controller for the mirror specifically. Also, it was like an above average card into the Unchained matchup. But you'll see that for like everyone else. This is like another list of the deck as well. But some other people decided to have Ash. There's 2 Dark Little More with 3 Book of Eclipse. So some people were still on the 50-50. And they decided a lot of hand traps. This deck, which is the Vanadium deck, the deck that Steven played, was all board breakers. Like Steven was convinced that he could break any board in the format, and that's why he went for a full board breaker approach, which is very interesting, okay? Because at YCS Indianapolis, you kind of had to make an educated guess, like on what you think you will play into, and you have to adapt your non-engine accordingly, and with the right matchups, and like in the Swiss rounds, as well as Top Cut, those non-engine will very much decide your fate, in my opinion. Because at a base level right now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, almost every engine is very, very strong in some sort of way. Like the Vanadium engine with character cards are very strong. The Rescue engine is very, very strong, right? So what kind of makes and separates the engines is like they have like in archetypes advantages. Like for example, like the Vanadium cards have Astrolaud, which is an absurd card. And then you have like the Rescue deck having the ability to kind of like abuse Little Knight, right? One of the better decks at abusing Little Knight. It had a huge versatility in its extra deck, so it can pretty much do whatever. It had access to Charmers as well, which I think was a huge reason why I think Rescue got way stronger. Like the access to Charmers, access to like cards like Celine, access code is like really, really insane. And you'll see that. See, like somebody like I think Hani took like more of a hand trap approach. Had some board breakers like Book of Moon. For the majority, it was like 75% hand traps in terms of non-engine. The Chillerman deck, you know, because of Dweller, decides to like main deck Nib. Had cards like Super Poly. This deck can't really play that many non-engines, so they have to go half and half there. But you pretty much see that it's kind of like all over the place, because a deck like Rescue main Econ, and then a deck like I think like the Vanadium deck also main Econ. So like they definitely, I think, were ahead of their time, because at the time of the YCS, no one really played enemy controller like that. And I think like enemy controller at this event specifically very much overperformed, right? And I think this is where we started to see like the shift into like more board breakers. And because more people played more board breakers at this event, I think that's why a deck like Vanadium performed, because they were just full comboing, and doing whatever they needed to do, right? Because not a lot of people also didn't main deck Droll and Lockboard. If you look at all these lists, no one really main deck Droll. So the Vanadium deck, when it went first, just pretty much Vanadium deck when it goes first can pretty much play through any hand trap. The only hand trap that really suffers is Droll and Lockbird, right? And you'll see that like it's crazy, because the one YCS right after that, YCS Richmond, people adapted really fast. They saw that a lot of people, like the reason why the Unchained deck won and started doing really, really well now is because of Vanadium, actually. Shout out to the Vanadium deck, because Triff decided to cook with Vanadium so hard that people got really scared, in my opinion. We don't see it in a lot of the topping lists, but in my opinion, I think a lot of people decided to main deck Droll, which is a huge shift from YCS Indianapolis, right? Because I think at YCS India, a lot of people weren't really maining Droll like that. I think more people were playing like the Veilers, the Imperms, because of how powerful they were into the Rescue Ace deck. But now you see that a lot of people started maining Droll, and Unchained came out on top because the Unchained deck just does not care about Droll. And if you look at the topping deck list, a lot of people who main deck Nib just performed well. Like we can even start all the way like from here. Like Labyrinth main deck the Nib. This deck didn't really main deck it, but they side it. This deck just had 0 non-engine. I guess just 3 Super Poly. This deck had Ash, Super Poly. Not that many, I guess. This just has Ash Shifter. 2 Nibs here. Totally decides to basically play his YCS list from the week before. People main deck Nibru from Justin. Main deck Nib here again. I decided to main deck Joel because I was that's how afraid I was. I literally main deck Joel because I was afraid of Vanadium. I didn't play any, but it was just so scary. And then you see the first and second place people both main deck Nibru. And if you look at their main decks, the hand trap count went up. Look at this. Unchained, 3 Ash, 2 Veiler, 3 Nib, 3 Imperm, right? Like 11 hand traps. Second place list, 3 Ash, 3 Nib, 3 Imperm, right? And then a little bit of board breakers, like 2 talents, 2 thrust, 1 talents. I main deck 12 as well because I thought that hand traps were gonna be a lot better and actually much more needed because of how well the combo decks performed last event, right? Because Vanadium I actually thought Vanadium was gonna win the YCS and that's that's kind of like why I kind of like tailored my non-engine a little bit around. The Pearly deck just naturally plays like 12 hand traps, but if you look at some of the Pearly lists in the past, there were Pearly lists that played like more. Like I think one of the Pearly lists that was played was like 3 Eclipse, 3 Dark Lunar More, 3 Book of Moon, right? So I think we're slowly moving to a hand trap format, slowly but surely. And obviously, like certain decks, like even like Tier Limits can't really play that many non-engine, but they'll still play like the Nib. And we're slowly moving towards that hand trap format, mainly because it seems like the decks in the format right now are just very, very strong. And if you don't choke them early enough, they have so much recursion for like on your turn that like they just generate so much follow-up. So like if it almost puts you in a weird predicament where if you're going for the board breaker approach but you don't kill them, you pretty much lose on the turn after. And so that's kind of like the format that we're in right now. And then the last tournament of the year is going to be like YCS Bologna. And I'm kind of curious to see what approach we will enter. I personally think that it will still be a very hand trap heavy format in Bologna because of the fact that there's like a lot of decks where, like, for example, like into like Centurion, right? It's like you kind of want to just Valor their Primera and make them pass turn. So that's currently my take. I think we're heading slowly but surely into a hand trap meta because no one's trying to get Calamity locked. No one's trying to get Infernoble comboed on. No one's trying to get Vanadium comboed on. No one's trying to get tiered on. And I think that like the board breakers will have, like, you might make the meta call that board breakers might be better because they play a little bit better into, like, let's say Unchained. If you play like, if you made like Econ, some of the board breakers might be a little bit better into like the rescue deck. But for the majority, I think for the other decks in the format, I think having hand traps might be a little bit more generic. So that's currently my take on it. Like I said, I think we're in a hand trap format. I think we have to be playing hand traps. But I'm curious to hear your take and what do you guys think. So let me know whether or not we're in a hand trap format or a breaker format.